Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to you all to our Chapter Zero session as part of the Climate Governance Initiative Summit. I'm Julie Baddeley, and I chair the board of Chapter Zero in the UK, as well as sitting on a number of corporate boards. I'm also the director of the Centre for Climate Change Engagement at Heathrow in Cambridge, which supports a lot of our work. Many of you will have been on the climate governance sessions in the earlier part of the week and will know about the initiative. It has chapters from around the world working together to address climate change at board level. Do register for the remaining summit sessions if you can, especially the closing one on Friday, that's tomorrow, with Nigel Topping and Mark Tucker and Emily Farnworth, which will look at collaboration, which is a very, very important part, as you know, of tackling the climate challenge. So just to tell you a little bit about Chapter Zero in the UK, we've been part of the Climate Governance Initiative from the very early days. We launched formally in June 2019 and have over 1,300 members. We partner with key UK business institutions and have chairs from some of the UK's biggest companies supporting our work. We're there to provide opportunities for non-executives to engage with other board members about the challenges and opportunities their companies face in addressing the climate emergency. And we run events to inform and activate our members and provide lots of toolkits and practical guidance. So then to Garp, which is the organisation which is very kindly hosting this event for us today. We've been working very closely with Joe Paisley, who heads up the thought leadership group at the Global Association of Risk Professionals, fondly known as Garp. For some time, they've been very, very supportive to our work and have run a number of sessions for us on risk. As we all know, the risk professionals are really key to this challenge because we need them to inform the board on the risks that they're facing. Jo will be our narrator for today's session, and she'll introduce herself fully a little later. And thanks also to Clyde and Co. and Willis Watson, who've helped develop today's scenario and are staunch supporters of Chapter Zero. So this will be a little different from the other sessions because it's going to be highly interactive. You're going to be making the decisions, and the panels will be commenting on the decisions that you make on a set of board dilemmas around the physical risks of climate change. So Jo, over to you, if I may.
Well, thanks very much, Julie. Welcome, everybody. My name is Jo Paisley, as Julie said, and I'm the co-president of the Garp Risk Institute. Really delighted to be part of this work with Chapter Zero. We have run a series of events unpacking physical and transition risk with both our global membership of risk professionals and the Chapter Zero non-executive director audience. Before I start, I want to just go through a few technical webcast tips just to make sure you all get the most out of today's event. I can hear a little bit of an echo in the background, so maybe if others go on mute, that would be helpful. Anyway, if your screen freezes, press F5 to refresh. That usually gets you out of most issues. For any technical difficulties, troubleshoot by clicking on the yellow help icon on the bottom of your console. Type any questions you have into the Q&A box. Now, that will be either technical questions, and they can be dealt with, or towards the end of today, we're going to have Q&A. Again, can I just ask any of the speakers to go onto mute now? If you want to download the slides, then click on the green page icon on your console. And finally, you can resize any of the windows today if you want to make some bigger or smaller, just by holding down and dragging down the bottom right corner of that particular window. So that's the boring stuff out of the way. So let's get on with the rest of today. Here's the outline, very simple. We'll just start with some scene setting. We'll then go into the scenario itself, and then we'll round off the session with panel observations and audience Q&A. So you can ask Q&A throughout, but I'm probably not going to get round to it until the end of the whole event. So think hard about what you want to ask the panelists. Now, as Julie said, this is going to be rather different from your usual webcast, as it's based around this fictitious global company in a fictitious scenario where you, the audience, are members of the board of that company. So you have a critical role to play in this. You're going to be asked to vote 4 times, 4 decisions over an 8-year scenario, which starts in 2022. Now, the voting is really important for this event to work. So take a moment to think about it. Don't take too long, and then do actually vote, because that's what makes the whole event make sense, if you like. So once you've voted, there will be an outcome. And then we will turn to our panel of experts who will provide their insights on the nature of the dilemma. So let me now introduce our panel of experts today. So we have Matt Gorman, who's the Carbon Strategy Director at Heathrow. And he's worked extensively on developing Heathrow 2.0, the airport's award-winning leadership plan for sustainable growth. Nigel Brook, partner and head of the climate risk practice at Clyde & Co. He leads their global campaign on resilience and climate change risk, raising awareness of climate-related legal duties and potential liabilities. Rowan Douglas, who's the head of the Climate Resilience Hub at Willis Watson. He's held appointments with the UN and other international organisations and has worked extensively to harness the role of reinsurance and insurance capabilities to meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And finally, of course, Julie Baddeley, who really doesn't need introduction from me, but she is the founder and chair of the Chapter Zero Network and one of the UK's most experienced women directors across both executive and non-executive roles. So what a fantastic panel. Thank you all very much for joining today's session. And as Julie said, although Garp's kind of held the pen on devising the scenario, we've had extensive input from teams from Clyde & Co. and Willis Towers Watson and Chapter Zero. So thanks to everybody. It's very much a collective effort. Right, on to the scene setting to get you into the mood for today's event. So we know that warming and the associated changes in the climate is leading to physical and transition risks. Now, our focus today in this scenario is very much on the physical risks, but I wanted to give you a bit of context on this. So the balance between physical and transition risks over the next few decades depends upon future temperature increases, which in turn depend upon net greenhouse gas emissions. And this chart, I'm sure familiar to many of you, just shows the many different possible future emissions pathways and the associated increases in global warming out to the end of the century. The physical risks from climate change will be obviously greatest in those high emissions scenarios. But as we want to avoid those catastrophic events, we are aiming to transition to a low carbon economy, which will limit the amount of emissions and warming, but of course brings with it certain transition risks. And those risks may be through, changing laws or policies or disruptive new technologies or whatever. Now, this chart is somewhat simplistic because it makes it all look very smooth and easily managed, which is probably pretty unrealistic, especially when you look at those low emission pathways. I mean, the chances are we will have a pretty bumpy road ahead, particularly if there's a significant delay in policy action. And of course, then the problem then is that we might have a more disruptive transition. The other point I'd like to make, which is sometimes kind of a little bit overlooked, is that there will be pretty significant physical impacts, even at what one might think of as a relatively low global temperature increases, say, 1.5 or 2 degrees. So it's not as if we won't have any physical impacts at all. In fact, we're already having those physical impacts. Right, to get you just into the mood of voting, we thought we'd just do a simple poll to begin with, just to make sure that you all understand how to actually use the voting buttons and that. So this is super simple. From your perspective, which of these will have the most significant impact on your business over the next 10 years? So do you think it's going to be coming from the transition risks? Now, that may be stemming from policy, legal, technology, or market changes. Or do you think it's the physical risks that are going to be more impactful, such as flooding, excessive heat, droughts and storms, and that sort of thing? So I'm going to give you a little bit of time. I can see some of the, I can see the numbers going up actually voting. So that's great. So just think about what in your particular business is going to be the most important. And I might just say that last November, we held an event with Chapter Zero, which looked at transition risks. So we're quite used to thinking about that. And there we looked at whether it was orderly or disorderly that was going to affect. So I'll be interested to see what we come up with today. Just over 60% of you have voted now, so have a little think which one you think, and then I think we'll have to press on given the time. Okay, I think we've got quite a lot in now, so I'm going to reveal the answer. I always know there's a bit of a lag when I reveal these, but hopefully you can see the results. I'm not actually that surprised. About 3/4 of you think that transition risks are going to be more impactful. And that's sort of what we've seen in other events as well, probably because, as you know, the physical risks will be worse, in decades' time. And of course, we're expecting policy changes probably this year, even with COP26. Nevertheless, what we have found is that often people haven't really thought in detail about how physical risks could affect them. So that's what we hope to achieve today. Hopefully, this will give you a few insights into just the range of different physical risks and how that might impact your particular business. All right, let's move on. Just before we get into the scenario itself, I thought it might be useful just to go through what those physical risks look like. And we tend to split them into two categories. You've got the acute risks, and they're what I call the weather-related events, such as storms or wildfires. And you just see the sort of scale of flooding in Australia at the moment, heat waves and that sort of thing. And then, of course, there's the chronic risks, which are the longer-term changes, such as rising sea level, changes in temperature, humidity, precipitation, that sort of thing. And this slide just gives you a few perspectives on both. On the acute side, we saw that 2020 was a record-breaking season for storms. Interestingly enough, the pace of change is such that a flood map, for example, which FEMA, that's the Federal Emergency Management Agency, they say it takes 7 years to complete, and it's probably going to be out of date by the time it's finished. And the probability of these events is rising, of course. The 2003 heatwave in Northern Europe, which caused 70,000 deaths, that was at the time a 1 in 500 event. Well, the climate models predict that this could well be a 1 in 2 event by the 2040s. And on the chronic side, beyond sea level rises, which will need significant investment in adaptation and large costs associated with corrosion and what have you, I think it's also worth just pointing out that the impacts don't end with the first order event. So we need to start thinking about the cascading impacts of some of these changes. I was very struck that Lloyd's of London developed a scenario which linked the heatwave in central Russia and the Ukraine in 2011 with the impact on wheat yields and with the Arab Spring. So those social impacts are not to be underestimated. And indeed, arguably in the COVID pandemic, it's been a very good example of just how interconnected the world is and how complex the risk landscape can become. We won't do justice to all those complexities today, but I hope that we'll give you a good flavour and you can really start thinking about physical risk from a business perspective. Right, so let's start the physical risk scenario. And here we are. You today have a very important role. You, the audience, are the board of a global hypothetical company called Our Co. Those of you who were part of the Chapter Zero event in November will be familiar with this board. As we've already mentioned, you're going to be asked to vote on various issues to help steer the company through this physical risk scenario. Once you vote, there will be an outcome, and then the panelists will give you their thoughts and perspectives on the dilemmas that you've been asked to vote on. And just to give you a sense of the types of things we're going to be looking at, it's going to be impacts on tangible and intangible assets, our supply chain, and our relationship with investors and the financial community. Our Co itself has 3 main divisions. There's the food and beverage and health and personal care units. They're the main profit centres. We also have a transport and logistics arm to get our products to market. We're pretty big. We employ 150,000 staff. We have an annual turnover of $75 billion, and we have more than 1,000 suppliers. So our supply chain is pretty complex. We pride ourselves on our green credentials. We've made a public commitment to reach net zero by 2040, and we made quite a big thing of that publicly. I think it's probably fair to say that we are more advanced in our thinking on the transition risk side, not giving any clues away. Right, our scenario then starts in 2020, where the board, that's you, are meeting to discuss flood risk in a food manufacturing plant that we are building in New Jersey. So here's a little bit of context about that. In 2018, the board, approved the building of a new food manufacturing plant, and the building work started on the plant in March 2021. And after the typical planning, design, procurement and approval stages, there's a bit of delay there. Now, at the point that the board approved this, our appointed engineers identified low to moderate flood risk. It's sort of 1 in 500. Now, the probability of extreme flooding has now been revised up considerably, and it's now considered to be about 1 in 100. We're halfway through the build. Our quote for insurance has doubled since 2020. We need to think through next steps now. Now, you might be thinking, well, how on earth did this happen? Well, it's partly because the 2021 updated FEMA flood maps have made it clear that the risk has been underestimated in the past. And in parallel, the latest assessment from the IPCC indicates that tropical cyclones are getting significantly wetter, and the flood risk for the east coast of the US has increased and will continue to increase after 2030, but it's not clear at this stage by how much. Now, the board, are pretty exercised about this. Did the engineering consultants consider the implications of changing climate on flood risk? Did they just rely on the old FEMA flood maps? You've got a lot of questions. With an asset life of about 30 years, we need to assess the risks of extreme flooding over that lifetime. So we're going to put 2 options to you now in the vote. And unfortunately, you're probably going to think, I don't have enough information, but that is the nature, I'm sure, of many of the decisions you have to take. You have to decide, are you going to go ahead with the build, 50% through, just going to carry on because you expect the government to build improved flood defences? Bear in mind, as I mentioned, we've made this very public commitment to reach net zero at 2040, and this plant does support our plans. It's much more carbon efficient. It supports our plans to reduce our carbon footprint by 25% by 2025. So if we don't go ahead, then those plans will be jeopardised. The alternative is to delay. Do we commission additional engineering and climate risk assessments? Consider building our own self-funded new flood defences as part of the plant construction project. Now, while you're thinking about this, and I can see the numbers of votes coming in, so thank you. Some of you are very clear what you want to do. We do expect the government to follow up on their plans. I mean, they've been very committed to it. It's just they will not be in place before the commissioning of the new plant. So there's going to be a time where we're not actually protected, and that's the gamble, isn't it? We do think that those flood defences would provide resilience for the anticipated life of the asset, although it's never that clear because the science is changing. And as I said, you've got to just remember that this plant is pretty critical for our plans to reduce our carbon footprint. So quite a lot of you still voting, numbers coming up. You'll probably, and if you do have any comments as you're going through, by all means, you can put just comments in the Q&A box. We'd be interested in those as well. So let me see how the vote's going. Yeah, we've got a good vote outcome here. I'm going to reveal the results. So, as you can see, a majority of you want to delay. You want to be cautious. You want to get some more information and consider the flood defences. And that's, absolutely fine. A third of you, just under a third of you think, no, want to push ahead. Let's rely on the government. That's probably going to be the cheaper option. Well, what's the outcome here? Bad luck, I think, probably. Actually, delaying was the better choice. The outcome is that we commission our own assessments, and we decide that on the basis of that, we're going to commit an additional capex of $15 million to provide our own defences. And that's actually helped us quite a lot. It delayed the opening of the plant until February 2024, but the flood hit just after that, and we are largely protected. Had we not gone ahead with our own flood defences and waited, then we would have found that we were severely affected, and we'd have had 6 months of highly interrupted, losing manufacturing capacity and losing revenue. So that would have been the worst outcome. So actually that was the better outcome financially. But unfortunately, in both cases with the additional costs, we now have a reduction in forecast revenues. It's meant that our investors are concerned. And unfortunately, they're not very happy at our AGM in the June. And DEF Asset Management actually declares that the board of ALCO has failed to provide share owners with the needed information to adequately assess their climate-related risks, and has committed the company to significant additional costs and reduced revenues. And they submit a resolution supported by major institutional investors with sizable stakes in ALCO. They want us to review our processes to assess the physical risks in ALCO's own operations and those of our supply chain. The resolution passes easily. The CRO, I'm afraid, gets heavily challenged that the risk function doesn't have sufficiently robust risk assessment processes. So all in all, we've got ourselves into a bit of a mess. And I think it's time that we get some expert opinion from our panelists. So I'm going to turn we're going to start with Julie, as she's ready to give us the wisdom. What do you think, Julie?
Well, I think what's very interesting about this is how many boards are not really aware of the extent of these physical risks. I mean, as you said earlier, the weather events, the floods, the heat, a lot of that's already baked in. So even though we might not know exactly where or when some of these things are going to happen, there's no doubt they are going to happen. And when I looked at the scenario, I felt that in 2018, when the board made the decision, there was actually a lot of data available, if you went to look for it, on predicted flood risk. But most boards probably were not really aware of it. So the first lesson, I think, on this is boards must seek the best data modelling. They really need to find the data so that they can base any investment appraisal on all this data around physical risk and transition risk for that matter, but factor that into all their thinking. So I would say that the board, if it's looking to commission a very large, expensive plant, it absolutely needs to insist on having really effective data modelling from a number of sources. I mean, the climate risk group in Cambridge has got amazing global maps of where floods and where heat are likely to happen. But I don't think a lot of boards are aware of that. So I think that's one lesson. One other point I would make is that I think shareholders are increasingly exercised about adaptation as well as net zero. I know that the race to zero is in front of mind because of the move towards COP26, but the race to adaptation is also incredibly important if we're going to preserve asset values. So boards need to have both these things on their agenda, and stranded assets are not just oil and gas reserves that you can't exploit. Stranded assets can be manufacturing plants. They could be hotels in places where you're not going to be able to have tourists. They could be goodwill on businesses that can no longer thrive in this new world because they're so carbon inefficient. And even people where the jobs no longer exist. It's a broad definition. So those would be a few points that I would make, Joe, on this particular scenario.
Great. Thanks, Julie. That's helpful. Matt, can I turn to you and get your perspective? If you're there, I think you make sure you're not on mute.
Sorry, mute on the screen, but not on the button. Afternoon, everyone. It's great to be with you, and thanks for the opportunity to take part. It's fascinating, this one. I'll say a very little bit about my business just to explain how we've thought about this. I work for Heathrow Airport, located to the west of London. Actually, I think we've been lucky as a sector here because the government in the UK about a decade ago started requiring big airports like ours and other big bits of infrastructure to produce a climate change adaptation report. And we draw off data from the UK's meteorological service, look at a range of different temperature scenarios, and they've got drill down into quite a level of detail as to what that might mean for us. So it's something we started thinking about. But I think the point Julie and Joe have made is right, that actually we were driven a bit by the government to be ahead of the curve. It might not have been something we'd started to think about otherwise. For us as a business, partly because we're away from the sea and partly because we are, the UK is a relatively temperate climate, we will see some more extreme weather, but we are relatively, I use that term advisedly, relatively well insulated from it, we think. We'll see some more intense rainfall. We need to think about that. We'll see higher temperatures. The big issue for us, and this kind of touches on Julie's stranded asset point, is the impact on the aviation network globally and indeed destinations that we serve around the world. For another example of asset risk, I think if you Google Osaka Airport in Japan and floods and find the images there, you'll see a low-lying sea-level airport flooded by as a result of a recent typhoon, and those kind of events. The frequency of those will increase in future, so it's a very live issue for some in our sector. I think the 2 points I'd draw out from this specifically are point on data I'd absolutely echo. I mean, I was genuinely surprised looking, I know it's a hypothetical scenario, but looking at this to see 2018, that data would absolutely have been available. It's available now. It may be that in different parts of the world you need to go looking for it more. Not every government like ours requires companies necessarily to consider those issues. But the data is absolutely there and very important to consider. I think the other point is that's particularly where companies have choices over where they invest. I've talked about my company is very geographically based. We own an airport in a particular location. So we, in a sense, we need to deal with the risks that presents us so we can continue to maintain that asset. But particularly where companies have investment choices and can choose different locations, I think considering that data will be increasingly important.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. That was really helpful. Rowan, any thoughts from you?
Thanks, Julian. Thanks. It's great to be with the group today. I agree. We could have hired a better consultant in 2018 who was thinking ahead. But we did sort of correct things, and we did try our best. And I think in some ways the shareholder reaction was a bit tough on us, actually. But I think it highlights a challenge that all boards will face. And unfortunately, many of us are going to have to start thinking more like insurers and reinsurers who are challenged by their shareholders and analysts to confront not what has happened, but what could happen now and into the future. And so if you speak to a board member of an insurer, they now no longer operate in the real world. They operate in the modeled world, where essentially they are having to explain either how their risk will exist under sort of existing scenarios, or if events have happened, how likely they were to happen. So as the audience suggested, for most of us over the next 10 years, transition risk will be the biggest impact because of policy requirements. And many will think, well, we might be hit by an extreme event, but we may well not be hit. But what will inevitably happen is that we will all be required, a little bit like Heathrow, but through different rules and regulations, to understand and disclose our risks. And I think that's where the real risk is, actually. And that's what tripped us up here at ARCO. I mean, the other thing I'd say, if I was trying to defend myself to our shareholders, is that they're lucky enough to be investing in a business of $75 billion of income. We have a very, unlike others, we have a very diversified global portfolio. And yes, unfortunately, we were struck in New Jersey, and perhaps we should have been more open with some of the risks we faced there. But nevertheless, it was probably a relatively minor component within our broader business, I would hope. And by investing in our company rather than perhaps a smaller company or one that's more geographically specific, actually we are offering a diversity of physical risks. So, but I think the key lesson here is, yes, as said, data analytics, but also the perils and challenges and needs of disclosure, where I think Nigel may have a few things to say on that. So back to the studio.
Yeah. Thanks, Rowan. And indeed, over to Nigel.
Yeah, so picking up Rowan's comments there, the past is no longer a good guide to the future with climate change, both for physical risk and transition risk. And duties of care for directors, the standards, the principles haven't changed that much in recent years, but the way those principles are applied to the facts of climate change will change, have changed. So taking this example, if you had rolled this back 10 years, the kind of data you're looking at here wouldn't have been available. You wouldn't have been tripped up in this way. Even if you'd gone looking for it, you wouldn't have found these kind of projections. But if you'd gone looking when this was signed off, you would have found it. There was someone failed to dig deeper and find out what was really likely to happen here, what was the real risk of a major flood event. And over time, that standard will therefore increase as applied to the facts. The facts change, the standard changes. So there will come a point, perhaps not today, but if a similar decision was made in, say, 2025, they might say, well, that's now, you've gone over the threshold here, you shouldn't have done that. That's a breach of duty on the part of the board. So this is a well-chosen example for showing a kind of cuspy case.
Thanks, Nigel. Cuspy, interesting. So let's move on then to the next dilemma. You've all got into it. You think you know what you're doing now. We are going to move forward to 2025. And here the board is meeting to discuss the impact of rising humidity on the supply and safety of our dried food products, production and storage. And just bear in mind that rising humidity is one of those chronic changes I was talking about earlier. Now, a little bit of perspective on this. So we are a major manufacturer of baby pasta food. Mothers and carers, parents, guardians love us all around the world. And production of this relies on maintaining humidity levels within a reasonably narrow range to prevent contamination and enable our food processing machinery to operate. Now, this has proved increasingly challenging over recent years as humidity levels have been increasing, and we're now approaching the upper levels of our safety and operational protocols. Now, this has been reported to the local regulatory bodies, and the board is going to be presented with 2 management actions, or options rather. So this is vote number 2. What do you think we should do here, given that we're at a risk of breaching these humidity levels? Do you think we should install new monitoring systems in all our plants and invest in additional drying equipment? That's going to increase our costs. It's also going to disrupt supplies in 2025 and 2026. And of course, those higher energy needs will increase our carbon emissions. Or do you think actually we should outsource the production of this to a third-party supplier? That's going to increase our costs a bit. It's going to also lengthen our supply chain, obviously, and we'll delegate quality control to a certain extent. And then we have to work out what to do with the asset. If no purchaser can be found for this existing plant, the asset might need to be written off. So there's the dilemma. Are we going to keep it in-house or outsource it? Now, bear in mind, this is one of our big products. We are, famous and popular with it around the world. But the thought of having disrupted supply for a couple of years might really put you off. Certainly, as I see the votes coming in, some of you are trying to get your head around this. Just to beware, the pace of the increase in humidity has taken us by surprise again. What happens if we breach those levels is we do risk quite considerably the risk of contamination, and that might be some fungal or biological infections. How do you weigh up these 2 options? Well, in vote 1, of course, you've got the higher energy needs, increasing our carbon emissions, which we'll need to offset. But in vote 2, of course, those emissions will just become part of our supply chain. So in a sense, maybe that's not a consideration you need to think about so much. Vote 2, of course, you've got that additional complication of the quality, monitoring the quality in our supply chain, and a possible asset write-off again, which would hit our bottom line if we can't sell it at book price. Other products not currently at risk will still have to be assessed, and this may actually start us thinking more strategically about the need to outsource or upgrade our plant and equipment throughout our operations. And just to reiterate, this is a big vote because it's our brand and our reputation is inextricably linked and driven by consumer confidence in the safety of our foods. Okay, well, I think the vote is coming in. Let me reveal how we're going. Okay, so 71% of you want to install the new monitoring systems in all the plants. You want to keep it in-house. You're obviously not favour of outsourcing it. I'm not surprised, given it's such an important one of our key products. Now, in both cases, the regulatory authority actually accepts our actions. We presented both options. We then say, well, we're actually going to pursue this, going to install new monitoring systems. And they're quite happy. They're not going to fine us or anything. We believe we've actually avoided and manage the risk of contamination and fungal infections. Indeed, had you voted to outsource, that would have also been quite a responsible way to act, except we would have had this extra complication in trying to manage the quality, given that we would have outsourced to a country where we weren't exactly sure whether their quality control was quite as good as in this country. But, and there's always a sting in the tail in these scenarios, the real problem is when the news of a potential fungal infection in Alco's baby pasta reaches the ears of a group of mothers who are very active on social media. Now, we think they got this from a Freedom of Information request by an NGO to the local regulator. That's where we think that this leak came. And even though we've done a really good job, we've avoided the infection, it's not enough to, unfortunately, prevent a massive social media backlash, #Babygate. Just the news that we were nearly, going to have this, we had this risk of a fungal infection, and probably on the back of also our inability to manage flood risk. Confidence in Alco's ability to manage their physical risk or their exposure to physical risk is not high. Within 2 days, the supermarkets begin to withdraw stock from the shelves, even though the risk isn't really real. Our share price declines by 25%. Media coverage is extremely poor. It takes on a life of its own. Consumer confidence takes a major hit. We have to hold a series of investor meetings to allay their concerns. We've got ourselves into a bit of a pickle again, and I need to get some help from our panelists. So I'm going to turn to, who shall I pick on first? Let's go for Matt, who's probably still on mute.
Thanks, Joe. I think I'm undone this time. Hopefully you can hear me. Yep. This is a tough one. I do feel, on behalf of the board, a bit put out by this, because it does feel like we've tried to take the right approach. And I was with the 71% who have voted for trying to sort the situation ourselves, as we've done. But what do I take from it? I think there's a couple of lessons. One is around risk assessment, actually. And I think thinking in quite a sophisticated way about risk and bringing in a range of different parts of the company, looking at this, could we have anticipated, with some of the changes in temperature and humidity, that this could be a risk that we were exposed to that we needed to get ahead of. Again, reflecting on our experience internally, the climate adaptation reporting that we do every 5 years, we've gone on a learning journey through that, and we've found it very helpful to pull in representatives from every bit of the business, from our operational teams, engineering teams, our future planners, designers who think about building structures and runways and so on. And you do get quite a rich and rounded perspective. So I think thinking about how companies can do risk assessments that pull in that range of expertise and try and anticipate some of these risks is important, and get the right external input on that as well. That might have helped us, I guess, anticipate this as a potential risk. I suppose the other one, although we didn't choose to go down the outsourcing route, the other one here is also thinking about where we've talked about physical risks for assets that we own as a company. Outsourcing doesn't necessarily remove those physical risks. So I think there'll be an increasing question for companies as they're thinking about their supply chains. Yes, there's a host of environmental and social considerations today, but I think the physical risks of climate in supply chains will become an increasing feature as well. And I think maybe something we touch on as we go forward through the conversation today. Thank you.
Brilliant. Yeah, thanks, Matt. Nigel, let's turn to you next.
I think this illustrates the point that there's an increasing interest in reporting and increasing expectations from a range of stakeholders, obviously first and foremost institutional investors. So this is climate-related risk, the humidity point, and that's, I think, is where a lot of institutional investor attention is being directed. And that's really ramped up in the last 2 years. They're obviously most interested in emissions, but I think other species of climate risk as well, they're intensely interested in a way they just weren't 5 years ago collectively. And so meeting those expectations is more and more challenging. I suppose there's an issue for the board. How much do you report here? So this one happened to blow up for no reason. There was actually nothing there, so to speak. But the more general issue about humidity in your supply chain, is that something perhaps that you should have flagged as an issue and then explained the steps you're taking to address it? These are the kind of choices I think companies are now increasingly going to face. How much do you front up on the issues that you're trying to tackle?
Yeah, no, good points. Rowan, your perspective, please.
Yeah, I think this is such a challenging situation for the company, and I'm sort of with Matt when I think he said it was pretty tough. It's difficult in some senses to kind of imagine what the company could have done differently, because in some sense it's as much a media management issue. It's not the investors only are getting upset because of the consumer pressure through the acts through social media. So in some senses it's not even an investor disclosure issue potentially. And as sort of Matt also indicated, using a third-party supplier, it doesn't reduce your physical risk effectively. It doesn't actually reduce your reputational risk. It's still your baby food. And so I'm going to sort of perhaps put something out there that a risk monger maybe shouldn't put out there, but there is going to be a level of risk management which is literally sort of unpredictable, and we are all going to face situations which are so unexpected that it's really very difficult to imagine how one could have sensibly and rationally managed for them. Or perhaps in this case, it's in some senses very, very bad luck. And I think there is a little bit of bad luck in this scenario. Clearly, we're all going to have excellent crisis communications partners. But I think there is sometimes a danger that we can assume that we can somehow, with all the right approaches, manage and forecast the unpredictable and unlucky side of this away, and we can't. And maybe we've all got to ensure a higher degree of, if you like, risk tolerance, both financially but also in other ways too, for a volatile world. Volatile, yes, with the physical environment we're facing, but also, frankly, as we've seen, a volatile world in how markets and consumers and social media are going to react to situations which, in some senses, they may sometimes, dare I say it, misinterpret. So, I find this quite a humbling scenario. There you go. Back to you, Joe.
Interesting. Yeah, I suppose there is an issue of just make sure you're better than your competitors, isn't there? Julie, any last thoughts from you?
Just a couple. I don't want to echo everything that others have said, but just to pick up on Matt's original point about what I would call a sort of bottom-up risk assessment, and segueing from that into engaging the whole company in the issues. I do believe this whole climate action challenge that we all have, whether it be trying to get to net zero or whether it's about adaptation, it is a challenge that requires boards and companies to really engage their whole workforce, whether it be on identifying the risks, because there will have been people out there who will have anticipated this humidity problem way before probably the sort of central people might have. But also in terms of thinking about how do we actually deal with these sorts of issues? How do we combat, how do we achieve our ambition for net zero by 2040? We need to get all our people signed up to the plan and contributing to the plan, because they will have loads of ideas and they will also be very concerned about the planet and the environment, especially the younger members of the workforce. So I think that's very important in this. I also think that we should remember that there's innovation that can come out of some of these things. So, for example, a point that hasn't been mentioned, but the notion that by upgrading your plant, you're going to possibly not have to dry the grain, and that will increase your carbon emissions. I mean, find more carbon-friendly drying techniques. That's we don't have to go back to previous methods. There's innovation that can help with all of this. And the final point is that we should be applying the same stringent standards to our suppliers as we apply to our in-house manufacturers. So that deals with option 2 to an extent. And I suppose just one last thing, we haven't talked about the customers. The communication issue here depended, I think, on talking to those customers, the retailers, very, very early on, because they will be sharing this problem with us when Babygate happens.
Yeah. Well, a range of views there, very, very useful. So we're sort of halfway through the scenario now, and we've talked a little bit about supply chain. We are going to move on now to 2028, and the board is meeting in January to discuss deforestation and supply chains, actually. So let's move on to there. Now, this dilemma, it stems from some satellite data that has detected deforestation in one of our key suppliers. Now, the images were taken between December 2023 and the December 2027, and they have been shared with prominent NGOs who plan to go public. The problem is, not only is it bad in itself, but it seems to contradict a statement that we made in our recent annual report. And to make matters worse, this supplier has also been disrupted by severe flooding, which the deforestation has itself contributed to. And that has an impact on the local economy. It's not huge at the moment, but it is not a particularly prosperous part of the world. And I'm not going to name where it was, because last time I did, I had a whole load of comments about why did you pick this country out? So it's going to be neutral. But we're going to have our third vote. And this is on, what do we do given where we are with this deforestation? Is your reaction that you just want to sack the supplier, even though they are a major local employer? And bear in mind that this is a part of the world where the economy is not as prosperous. If we do that, then we can diversify the supply chain base. It adds costs, but it also we can build resilience. Of course, there may be compensation claims locally. We don't know. Or do you think, look, we want to work with the local employer, the local supplier. We want to work with them to improve their environmental standards. We know that we haven't been monitoring them or managing them closely enough. Do we want to actually be proactive, offer compensation to the locals, perhaps start a tree planting program to make good the environmental degradation? Which of these two are you minded? Which of these actions are you minded to pursue? And while you're just thinking about that, I mean, one of the problems here, of course, is that the supplier hasn't been open with us. Do you think actually we should just go and sue them because they have effectively hidden the extent of deforestation? It does look like a potential PR disaster in the making. And of course, it does also make us question our internal processes for managing the supply chain. Do we know where things are being grown? Do we know do we have the right information internally? Do we know what's happening on the ground? Have we been a little bit remiss by not being on top of this? And I think these are all questions that the board members are probably thinking about as they're voting here. So I'm going to let you just mull that one over a little bit. you're probably thinking, well, whatever we do, we're going to need to get our heads around this. We're going to have to really start reviewing our supply chains more thoroughly. That is for sure. Can see quite a lot of you voting here. It's coming out in an interesting way. I'm going to give you just a few more seconds. Okay, I think we've probably got enough votes in. I'm going to just share with you the answers here. I think that's shared. To give it a few seconds to come through. So, big majority of you want to work with the local suppliers. I'm wondering whether the way I put it, I steered you towards that. I didn't mean to, not meaning to steer the audience here. But you obviously liked the sound of the tree planting and helping the local economy and all of that good stuff. So that's great. Now, the interestingly enough, that was the better outcome. And I do worry that perhaps I was aware of that when I put the dilemma to you. The first vote, had you sacked the supplier, it actually looks superficially cheaper, but we caused quite a lot of resentment and there were compensation claims that came through. The second one was certainly better for our reputation. We turn it into a little bit of a PR win. We work with the local supplier, we improve their environmental standards, we offer compensation to the locals, and we start a tree planting program. In either case, we decide we need a project to review our supply chain, and we embark on a project with an external satellite data provider so that we get the in-house data expertise that we really need. So we've sort of turned it around, but let's turn to our panelists again and get their perspective. So let's start with Nigel this time.
Right, thanks, Joe. Well, I think quite a bit depends on how much this company's made of its credentials in this area, SDG credentials. Could it be accused of greenwashing? There's also an issue about if there are green loans, because these often come with strings attached, quite stringent strings, and that would be an issue for the company in this situation. Had it made promises that there'd be no virgin forest in its supply chain. But in fact, things are really moving on. So just a week or two ago, the European Parliament overwhelmingly voted through a proposal, it's only a proposal at this stage, for legislation that would force companies headquartered in Europe to carry out due diligence on their supply chains for environmental and human rights violations. So this is exactly the kind of thing that this would be aimed at. So they'd have to monitor, prevent and remedy those breaches. The European company itself would have to take responsibility for doing that, whatever it took, and then to report on any breaches it found and the steps it was taking. And where Europe leads, others often follow. In fact, Germany just passed a similar law, but with less powerful. So I think where at the moment we're talking about best practice and potentially just applying common law or equivalent principles, this could, in the foreseeable future, become a stringent legislative requirement.
Right. Well, that's a warning indeed. Rowan, how about your thoughts on this?
I did, Joe. I was quite also pleased and pleasantly surprised by the audience vote. Actually, clearly got very, very sensible co-board members and shareholders. I think we're at quite an interesting inflection point in this whole sort of journey. So at the moment, we are I'm talking about in the real world right now, not in the scenario. I'll come to the scenario in a second. But we've been in a time when the progressive organisations perhaps have been focused on, how can I put it, metaphorically, divestment. What I mean is seeking to avoid or literally sort of divest themselves away. And I don't just mean from investment, it could be customers, it could be suppliers, organisations which are perceived as being sort of beyond the pale, but at the same time literally divestable. And that's obviously been an important influence in the current zeitgeist. But in some ways, that's the easy bit for some organisations. And if you like, there's a bit of a race or a competition to divest. But quite quickly, the real challenge, if we're going to decarbonise or become more resilient, or to respect communities which are in particular danger zones, is actually going to be around engagement. Who is going to, as leading companies like the one we're representing today, the 75 billion hour code, I think fairly soon, and certainly by the time of this scenario that we're looking at now, Joe, actually will be in a very different era, and companies will compete, yes, around net zero alignment, but it'll be about, in some senses, how they're seeking to reduce systemic risk and how they seeking to play a role in building resilient and aligned societies. So actually, the real grown-ups in the room, and we at ARCO do perceive ourselves as an institution that is going to help steward this transition and be recognized and respected and rewarded for it, is to actually engage. So I think our voters today have been very progressive, because that is how we will prove our commitment. Now, of course, if our suppliers, partners do not appropriately respond to our support, encouragement, then that's a different issue. But yeah, I think we're adopting a very sensible approach here.
Well, you would expect nothing less, would you, with an audience like this?
Absolutely.
Julie,
Absolutely.
Let's turn to you, Julie.
Thanks, Joe. Just a couple of points, really, because Nigel's and Rowan's are right on the button here. The first thing is just to remind ourselves of how interconnected all these ESG factors are. I mean, this is an interesting piece of the scenario, because it touches a lot of different factors. So it's not just about climate, although that's what Chapter 0 is primarily focused on, but we absolutely recognise that you can't tackle climate without tackling biodiversity and soil degradation, loss of forests, community needs. It's a very broad set of goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. You'll have seen my pin, and they are very interconnected. But we believe that climate is driving a lot of the others, unfortunately, in the wrong direction, because it's a sort of overarching challenge. So just on the specific scenario, I mean, the satellite technology is absolutely stunning. I mean, the globe is being surveyed now, almost every minute of every day, and they can drill down to one tree. So there really is no excuse not to know where damage is being done and take action appropriately as a result of that. So maybe some sort of partnership with a satellite technology firm would be a good one for ARCO. And also, I mean, Nigel talked about the reporting, but by 2028, I would think product labeling will be requiring authentication of the fact that this sort of damage isn't being done. So consumers will be demanding to know what the origin of their products is and how it's being handled. So I think those would be two specific points I would pick up on this one, in addition to what my fellow panelists have said.
Yeah, no, thanks. So I think really interesting, the interconnectedness of the risks, and also it is hard to imagine what the social norms will be then. So Matt, let me just end with you on this dilemma.
Thanks. I thought I'd echo what people have said, and I thought Rowan put it very well, talking about the need to think about systemic risk and engage as a leading company. I think is absolutely right. I suppose if I was putting myself in the board shoes, 7 years from now, just thinking about the kind of company Arco is, I'd probably be feeling we might have missed a bit of a trick here in terms of our approach to supply chain. We are a manufacturer. We've got a big food and beverage division. We've got 1,000 suppliers around the world. I suppose I'd be hoping we'd have quite a good feed up already of some of the risks that might be exposing us to. And I think it just underlines the importance, particularly for organisations with that kind of supply chain, of having the right approach to mapping and understanding those risks initially, but then addressing them. And it was, as Rowan said as well, and others have, great to see the vote for engagement, which absolutely feels the right approach. I think the final point was Julie's one on data really struck me actually as well. The point on satellites, imagery and surveys, and the ability to tap into increasingly sophisticated data sources in monitoring supply chains, I think is one aware of, certainly, and I'm sure other companies are increasingly aware of and using. I think that's going to be a growing feature as well. But I think overall this kind of sense that, yes, by 2028, we probably should have been a bit further ahead of the curve on this, perhaps.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair enough. Although, of course, if we were brilliant, it would be a very dull scenario, wouldn't it? So True. Let's move on. We will move on to the last of the votes, and the board is going to meet in January 2030. And here we're going to discuss external views from our investors, and in particular our main bank. Now, here the challenge really is that Alco, we've been doing a lot of good work internally, but the risk team's work just doesn't seem to have really caught up, or is not keeping up with the pace of change in the knowledge that our financial investors are gleaning. And so we're, in some ways, we've lagged a little bit still. And this just shows you sort of some of the key points you need to think about ahead of the last vote. In particular, the banks and shareholders are asking why the long-term viability statement that we made in our 2025 annual report didn't actually take account of the physical risks associated with climate change. Now, just in terms of the timeline, that report was published in just after the floods and Babygate. So they're looking back and they're thinking, well, hold on, you didn't have all the risks there. The auditors to our accounts are also under scrutiny for not challenging the reports more. And a number of recent analyst reports have also revised their assessment of our ESG credentials, unfortunately, with one in particular singling us out for a lack of transparency on our adaptation plans. The rubber really hits the road, unfortunately, in our bank lending review. And this is a regular meeting we have with the banks to renew our lending, and it's apparent that the company's security and long-term stability is much more precarious than the last time they looked at it. The banks have become much more sophisticated in their own assessments of the financial impacts of transition and physical risks from the climate change. And that follows a huge increase in regulatory scrutiny, increased stress testing requirements by bank regulators around the world. So, in a way, the financial system's sophistication has leapt forward, and we haven't really kept up. Now, the CFO of Alco realises that our debt will become significantly more expensive unless we can really demonstrate robust mitigation. And there is a risk that the bank won't renew our facilities. So here's your last dilemma, board. What do you want to do? Do you want to get an external body to review our risk assessment? And then we commit to share that outcome with the banks and the investors? Do we want to be super transparent? Or do we actually think that they're wrong and we want to push forward with the loan renewal with a robust defence of our security and ability to service the loans. And here our defence is that the physical risks identified by them do not affect the long-term viability of a company. So here it's a matter of like, how confident are you in what we've done internally? You know, we have invested, as you know. We've employed satellite data. We're doing some work with them. An external consultancy has been brought in. But, you know, we are mindful that all of these regulators around the world have really been pushing the banks to really up their game. And we know that they have got their own sources of data. So here it's, how much do you think, you know, we've done well internally? And how much do you think, well, actually, you know, they've got a fair point. We need an external person, external body to come in and look at how good we are. And I can see, a number of you still thinking about this one. So just in terms of like where we've come from, remember, we've come a long way. It's 2030 now. Hard to imagine exactly what the environment is, the social norms, the norms amongst regulators, amongst the financial community. Do you think at this point that ALCO has done enough? You know, how confident are you that we've really kept up and we've been doing as much as we should have been doing? So I can see the votes coming in. A number of you still thinking. And thanks also, I can see quite a lot of questions coming in. So I'm going to sort through some of those in a minute. Lots of questions there. And mindful of the time, so I'm going to just reveal the responses to this last question. Right. So as you can see, vast majority of you, not so confident actually that we really have got a grip here. You want to, like, nearly 90% of you want to take this external risk assessment and then share the outcome. So that's interesting. And in terms of the actual outcome here, well, the vote to undertake the external review, that we are actually praised by the market for our transparency, and the outcome isn't too bad. Bear in mind that we have actually been working with the satellite data company, and we've done more than you might think. We also employ a physical risk specialist, and we, over the years, we have been mapping systematically our supply chain, given the deforestation issues, and we've pretty much got our house in order. On the back of this, we publish the assessment, part of a TCFD report. We also issue our first green bond, and we are offered better terms on our sustainability-linked bonds, loan rather. So not too bad, actually. Had you decided to push forward with the loan renewal vote 2, then actually what would have happened, I would have said that the bank and the auditor actually insist on external verification anyway. So we ended up kind of in the same place, but you win some points for being proactive and transparent. So let's turn to the panel. Who wants to go first? Let's start with Julie. I'm going to do that. Julie, what's your thoughts?
So I'm mindful of time, Joe, here, because we want to get time for some of the questions. So I'm only going to make one point on this. Which is a bit of an obsession of mine, so I crave your indulgence on it. I mean, there's so many rules now being set out by banks around the world, or central banks like the Bank of England, around banks and investors assessing their portfolios. And they can only assess the portfolios accurately and make decisions around that if they get the underlying data from the companies that they are invested in or lending to. And at the moment, there is a gap. I mean, we at Chapter Zero spend a lot of time talking with both banks and investor groups. And there is no doubt that there is a gap in terms of the knowledge that they are, or the data that they're getting from the companies, the underlying investee companies. that contribute to their portfolio assessment. And we need to close that. And I think we're going to be forced to close it to an extent by compulsory TCFD reporting, but that will come in slightly over time, and also doesn't immediately affect all the companies in all the indices. So I think it's a very, very important point that we're looking at here, and I'm glad that our audience took the decision that they took.
Great. Okay, Nigel, any quick thoughts on this one before we get to Q&A?
Yeah, just some overarching points about this. Just pick up those points about satellite data. They can actually identify individual tree species now. Using artificial intelligence, they can spot trees down to a canopy of 2 meters. So just imagine what they'll be able to do by 2030. And I think more generally, the world's going to become radically more transparent. Data is going to be democratized like never before. So supply chains will be knowable in granular detail, and the expectations on companies, I think, will just grow in accordance with that. Trees are just one example. It's just everything about the supply chain will be known or knowable. So I think the expectations will grow, and the legal duties will grow with expectations. So this is one-way traffic.
Yeah, absolutely. Matt, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'd echo those points. And I think just in the interest of time as well, just spend a second on TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. Just reflection from my experience, our experience at Heathrow on that. We produced our first disclosure in last year's annual report. In this year's, we've gone to a mature disclosure, and that involves quite thorough thinking about both the transition and the physical risk that we face as a company, but has been a very useful process. The structure is logical. It forces you to ask the right questions. We've brought in some good external input. We've engaged broadly within the company, as I described before, to get a range of input to that. And it's been, I think, I would recommend it to companies on the call that are thinking about it or haven't used it yet. Do go and look at that. As Judy said, I think there will be, over time, requirements to report in line with that kind of framework. It's a voluntary framework at the moment, but it's one that really helps you think about the risk, I would say.
Yeah, no, thanks. Rowan, last minute thoughts from you before we go to Q&A.
Sure. As Matt said, TCFD is going to become important. The UK's just launched a consultation to essentially make TCFD reporting mandatory next year by most companies, large private companies, as well as publicly quoted and others. So by 2020, this will be a well-trodden path. My only 2 comments are this part of the scenario indicates how the financial system will actually become the stewards of the whole economy transition. They will drive the attraction of capital, and that's where I think policymakers see the lever. So no surprise of today's announcement about TCFD, or yesterday's. And then the final point is to reinforce my earlier one. The battle that will be fought will be in the modelled world. So the decision by our board was absolutely correct, because there is no good trying to confront investors, shareholders, and other stakeholders in this area if you do not have the analytical and modelling information and the skill to articulate a story. And without that, you're going into these conversations essentially without a voice. So absolutely the right decision, and great. So yeah, look forward to the Q&A.
Great. Okay. Well, I am mindful of time. That's really for your reference. We've had 4 votes, and we're gonna push on with just some Q&A. And I'm going to start with the first one, which I think is absolutely key, really. So in considering these dilemmas, the relationship with the board's risk appetite is key. How well do you believe companies are really able to articulate this in a meaningful way that helps guide these judgments? I think that's a brilliant question, a difficult one, and I'm going to go to Rowan first.
I think in these areas we're still, in many companies, at the sort of at the stage of sentiment and sort of qualitative feeling about this, which then is quite difficult to then integrate within a rigorous risk appetite framework. But what is going to happen is the increasing quantification of these risks, and obviously we've been coming to this, haven't we, Joe, through the prism of the Garp community. So we will develop, they already exist, but I think they're going to become more understood and embedded. Companies will have to disclose their annual average risks from these types of, in this case, physical perils, but actually also what's their expected 1 in 20-year event now and going into the future, and what's their expected 1 in 100-year event. And fortunately, while there is uncertainty, these risks do obey the laws of physics, and there are well tried and tested approaches which are going to mean that these risks can be quantified within ranges of uncertainty, and those quantification metrics of frequency and severity of duration of ultimately financial impacts will then obviously allow us to put this within a rigorous, wider risk appetite framework. So it sounds weird, doesn't it, that physics is, well, geography is going to become a driving force within the financial system, but I've seen it happen in the insurance world, and it will happen more broadly.
Interesting. Matt, how about your perspective on that one, the risk appetite one? Just make sure you're not on mute still.
Yep, sorry, I was muted again. Yeah, no, I'd echo, I think, much of what Rowan said there, actually. Sorry, I'll be absolutely honest. I was scanning through some of the other questions to see what was coming, so I didn't fully develop a response on that. So if you want to go to others or move on to the next question, you might get more insight at this age. Sorry.
No, that's no problem. I want to turn on to another question now. Let me see. Let me ask you this one then. See who wants to answer this one. Somebody's made the point that physical risk should be at the heart of any business continuity plan. So the plan that didn't include climate risk is just a bad plan. I mean, is that fair, or is there more to it than that? Who would like to take that one? I'll let you all volunteer.
I'll
Matt,
have a quick go at that one.
Okay, you go for that.
Diving quickly. I mean, I do think... I think it's right, actually. And I think one of the conclusions certainly I've drawn listening to this debate is companies using the right data and frameworks to understand the physical risks that they may face. It's important now, but will become increasingly important. I think the other thing that struck me listening to this is how those risks manifest will vary from company to company. I mean, at one end of the spectrum, you've probably got a company like Heathrow, which is very geographically rooted. We just need to think about a site, really. But we also need to put that in the context of the global network that we serve. What are the implications for air travel more broadly, for destinations? For other companies, there'll be a whole range of sites in different locations. And we've also touched on the supply chains and how the risks that they are exposed to now will be in future. So I think that I think it is critical, but exactly how it plays for different companies varies quite a lot. I think I come back again and again to data on this, finding the best data sources, and we've touched on some of those to understand these risks, using a framework like TCFD then to really quantify them and prioritize them, I think is key.
Great.
Joe,
okay.
can I just add a comment,
yes,
Joe? May I just add a comment to that? I know we're running out of time here, but just to extend it, because I think it was a very good question about the fact that the physical risk and transition risk should be embedded in your risk assessment. But the really important point is it should be embedded in all your processes. It needs to be embedded in every strategy discussion. It needs to be part of all the standard business processes. There should be no investment appraisal that does not include these risks and some sort of carbon approximation cost included. So I think one of the lessons I've learned in the last sort of 12 months of sessions with our board members is that absolutely we need, in every single discussion that we're having around our organisation about where we're taking the organisation, we need to include the ESG factors and the climate factors in that embedded in that conversation.
No, thanks, Julie. I've got another question for you, actually. I think this one is aimed at you. Could you talk briefly about the importance of board member alignment on this, getting the whole board in the right direction?
Well, to me, it's absolutely vital. And the reason I say that is because I think the changes required in companies to tackle these issues are so far-reaching, and they challenge so much of the sort of status quo, if you like, that if you don't get board member alignment, you're never going to deliver the outcomes. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that all board members are going to agree on every aspect, and it also doesn't mean that all board members will be equally aware and up to speed on all aspects of these issues. I don't think we need to expect that, and it wouldn't be normal in a board discussion. You would always have people who are more knowledgeable about some topics than others on a board. But when it comes to actually signing off a strategy and ambition, and then the robust plans that sit underneath that, and the metrics which then go into the remuneration, for example, to go through that whole loop, you do need all the board members to agree with where the company is going on this, or I don't think you'll deliver the outcome.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And of course, that's what Chapter 0 helps on all of this. We don't have time for any other questions, but I would like to just round off with, giving you all an opportunity just to give almost like a 1-minute view on what you thought of the scenario, any last-minute thoughts. Just some of the questions that I haven't had time to get to has been quite interesting about almost like the moral perspective of this, and the importance of doing the right thing, stewarding the company and helping the economy. Let me start with Rowan, please, just for the last minute thoughts. Who might be on mute?
I disappeared.
You did. You're back.
I had a resilience crisis.
You got there.
Yeah, I did.
So, any last thoughts, Rowan? Just sorry to put you on the spot on the whole scenario, and any learnings any last messages you want to give the audience?
I just say that as well as spreadsheets, we're going to have to start getting used to maps, and we're going to have to start thinking a bit spatially. So any of you who did geography in the dim and distant past, you can now become the emerging talent in your organisation. But seriously, we're all going to have to embrace this with a degree of relish and confidence. But it isn't going away. So the key thing is to dive in. And I think the scenarios you've put together, Joe, with the wider team have been fabulous to help us think through these issues.
Thanks a lot, Rowan. Nigel, any last thoughts?
Yeah, metrics and benchmarks, I think, are going to become front and centre. There's already a feeding frenzy for experts who have the wherewithal to measure physical risk, measure transition risk. This is something that lots of stakeholders, including investors, are hungry for, so they can then benchmark companies against each other. So I think there's going to be big pressure on that. I think also that things are moving fast, even before concerted policy ambition, which we hope to get out of COP26. But the pressure generally on companies to address climate risk, which is pervasive, which interacts with and multiplies other risks, the known risks, is going to be more and more intense. And it takes a long time, especially for a large company. It takes a long time to actually get fully to grips with this and then change the way that governance, risk management, and day-to-day decision-making is influenced by all of this. TCFD, a lot of people would say, is a 3-year process at least to actually get it fully done, and a lot of companies are not doing the TCFD in the full way. So I think there's the lesson from all of this. I think these scenarios are really brought to light the earlier you start getting to grips with this, the better it is, and it will then become a competitive advantage.
Yeah, no, I think they're wise words there. Matt, any last thoughts from you?
I'll be very swift looking at the time. Echo all of that. I was a geographer in the dim and distant past, so I obviously entirely agree with what Rowan had to say. But I think the two key things I'd come back to from today are, I think, data, as we've said repeatedly, and that is maps as well as spreadsheets, but really getting the best data to understand risks. And that idea, I like Joe's phrase of bottom-up, Judith's phrase of bottom-up risk assessments, that idea of going into the organisation and pulling people who really know different bits of the business and getting them to think in a really thorough and creative way about what some of the risks might be, I think is going to be an important part of companies preparing themselves.
Thanks very much. And so I can hand back to you, Julie, just to end up today's session. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you, Joe. And just my final thought before I thank everybody for being with us, which is the point that you made that we didn't get to answer, which was about doing the right thing. And I really believe now, having looked at this in some detail, that there isn't a contradiction between doing the right thing and protecting long-term value. I think that if we don't do the right thing, that we lose value in the longer term. And with all the work that's going on in companies all over the world on purpose, corporate purpose, that's the thread that to me brings all of these things together, so that we are able to fulfill our function in the world in a way that doesn't damage it. So thank you, everybody, very much. Thanks to all our panelists. Thank you, Joe, for doing an absolutely sterling job over quite a tough scenario, and to Garp for hosting this with us at Chapter Zero. And I hope that I'll see lots of our audience on some of the other sessions that we're running as part of the summit. So net zero collaboration is essential to future-proofing business, and that's our final closing session tomorrow. Do sign up to listen to Nigel Topping, Mark Tucker and Emily Farnworth for that. That, I think, will be a great session. Thank you, Joe.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.